When my son died, his wife inherited the house and $25 million and then kicked me out, saying, "You're not welcome here anymore. Go die in the trash." But a few days later, the lawyer laughed and said, "Did you listen carefully to the will?" What was in the will caused my daughter-in-law to faint from shock. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. The mahogany casket gleamed under the gray Texas sky, threatening rain that hadn't come yet. 37 people stood around my son's grave, their black clothes making them look like crows against the spring grass. I held Jeffrey's third-grade school photo in my weathered hands, the edges soft from years of touching. My boy was gone, 45 years old, and the cancer took him anyway. Zella positioned herself at the head of the casket, playing the grieving widow perfectly. Her black designer dress probably costs more than most folks here made in a month. Those manicured nails painted dark red rested on the polished wood like she owned it, like she owned everything. The minister was halfway through his speech about eternal rest when she moved. Her high heels clicked against the cemetery stones as she approached me, that calculated sympathy painted across her face. "Clyde," she whispered, but loud enough for Mrs. Henderson and the Johnsons to hear. Her perfectly manicured hand touched my arm. "I hope you don't think you'll be staying in my house after this." The words hit like ice water. Several mourners shifted uncomfortably, pretending they hadn't heard, but they had, everyone had. I gripped Jeffrey's photograph tighter, feeling my jaw muscle tense. "This is my son's home, Zella." "Was your son's home?" Her voice carried that sweet venom she'd perfected. "Now it's mine." Jeffrey left everything to his loving wife. Mrs. Henderson gasped softly behind her gloved hand. Obie Smith stepped closer, his weathered face hardening. These people had known Jeffrey since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. They'd watched him build his construction empire from nothing. "We haven't heard the will yet," I said quietly, keeping my voice steady despite the fire building in my chest. Zella laughed. Actually laughed at my son's funeral. "What's to hear? I'm his wife. Who else would he leave millions to?" The minister paused mid-sentence, clearly uncomfortable. Folks were staring now, some looking away in embarrassment. This was supposed to be about Jeffrey, about honoring his memory. Instead, this woman was turning it into her personal show. "The deceased was a generous man," the minister continued, trying to regain control of the service. "A pillar of our community, a pillar who knew how to take care of his family." Zella interrupted, smiling at me with those cold blue eyes. "His real family." That's when I understood. This wasn't grief talking, or even greed. This was strategy. She'd planned this moment, chosen this public setting where I couldn't respond the way my blood demanded, where she could establish her narrative in front of witnesses. The minister finished his prayer, while dirt began falling on Jeffrey's casket. Each shovelful felt like another piece of my heart breaking, but Zella's smirk, that triumphant little smile as she watched my face, that was burning itself into my memory. She returned to her widow performance, accepting condolences from people who'd known Jeffrey since childhood, playing the grieving wife, while the real grief, mine, got shoved aside like yesterday's newspaper. As they lowered my boy into Texas soil, I made myself a promise. Whatever game Zella thought she was playing, she'd picked the wrong opponent. The rain finally started as the last shovel hit wood. As the crowd dispersed toward their cars, I stayed behind. The gravediggers had finished their work, and Jeffrey's temporary marker stood crooked in the fresh dirt. I placed my single red rose on the mound, the same variety his mother had grown in our garden 30 years ago. Zella's laughter carried from across the cemetery, where she held court with a group of mourners, probably spinning her soba story about the poor widow's burden. The wind caught my gray hair and arthritis, sent familiar aches through my hands as I stared at that school photograph. Jeffrey at 8 years old, gap-toothed grin and cowlick that never would lie flat. When had that bright-eyed boy become the hollow-cheeked man I'd visited in that Houston hospital room? March 2023, MD Anderson Cancer Center. The smell of an aseptic couldn't hide the fear in that place. Jeffrey had lost 40 pounds by then, his expensive suits hanging loose on his shrinking frame, The experimental treatments weren't working, but he kept fighting, always fighting. "Dad, I want you to know I took care of you," he'd said that day, gripping my hand with fingers that felt like bird bones. "Whatever happens, you're protected." I hadn't understood then. Figured he meant the life insurance, maybe some savings account. Jeffrey had always been responsible, even as a kid, saving pennies in mason jars. But watching him struggle through those final months, I saw something else. Fear. Not of dying. Jeffrey wasn't afraid of much, but fear of leaving things unfinished, leaving people unprotected. The memory shifted backward 20 years earlier. Jeffrey at 25, standing in what would become his first office, a rented space above Murphy's hardware store, with a folding table for a desk, and dreams bigger than Texas itself. "I'll never be poor like we were, Dad," he'd promised, working 16-hour days to turn that $5,000 loan into something real, building subdivisions across 3 counties, creating jobs, making families happy in homes his company constructed. Success came fast once it started. First million at 35, 10 million by 40. But the work never stopped. Jeffrey drove himself like a man possessed, chasing something I never quite understood, maybe chasing away the memory of government cheese and second-hand clothes, of watching his mother count pennies at the grocery store. The photograph trembled in my arthritic hands, that last coherent conversation in February. 3 days before the end, Jeffrey's voice, barely a whisper but his words sharp with urgency. "She's not who I thought she was. Dad. Zella, I figured it out too late. Son, you're tired. The medicine, the will. I made sure you're protected. Promise me you'll fight if you need to." I'd promised, not knowing what I was promising. Figured it was the medication talking or pain making him paranoid. Jeffrey died believing I understood, and I'd failed him in that final moment. Now standing over his grave while his wife celebrated 50 yards away. Those words felt like prophecy. Money hadn't saved him. All those years building wealth, sacrificing health and time and peace of mind, and cancer took him anyway. The cruel irony burned worse than Zella's threats, but Jeffrey had been smart, smarter than his old man gave him credit for. Those final months while fighting for his life, he'd been fighting for mine too. I tucked the photograph into my jacket pocket, as Zella's voice carried across the cemetery. "Well, it's time to discuss practical matters." She was approaching with her group of witnesses, probably planning another public humiliation. My grip tightened around that school photo, feeling its soft edges press into my palm. Whatever Jeffrey had planned, whatever protection he'd promised, I was going to need it soon. The rain was coming down harder now, and Zella's designer shoes would be getting muddy. Good. Let her struggle with something, even if it was just walking across wet grass. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked toward my old Ford pickup. Car doors were slamming across the parking area, engines starting, people eager to escape the awkwardness Zella had created at the graveside. She intercepted me halfway to my truck, her designer heels clicking on the wet pavement. Mrs. Henderson, Joe from First National Bank, and 3 other MERS flanked her like a jury she'd assembled. Strategic positioning. I recognized it from my army days. "Clyde, you need to understand reality." Zella planted herself directly in my path, those cold blue eyes locked on mine. Jeffrey left everything to me. The house, the business, the investments, all of it. Her confidence was absolute. This wasn't bluffing or wishful thinking. She knew something the rest of us didn't, and she was enjoying the revelation. I kept my voice level, the way you do with spooked livestock. "We haven't heard the will yet, Zella." "What's to hear? I'm his wife." Her laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Did you think he'd leave millions to someone who never contributed a dime to his success?" The witnesses shifted uncomfortably. Joe cleared his throat and studied his shoes. Mrs. Henderson clutched her purse tighter, clearly wishing she was anywhere else. But they stayed. That was the point of this little theater, creating witnesses to her dominance, establishing the narrative before anyone could challenge it. "I know this is hard," she continued, tilting her head with practiced sympathy, but you can't live in denial. Jeffrey loved you, but he was practical. He knew I'd need everything to maintain the lifestyle he built for us. The cruelty was breathtaking. Not just the words, but the timing, the public setting, the witnesses she'd gathered to watch my humiliation. This woman had studied pain like other people studied recipes. Everything all right here. Clyde, Obadiah Smith approached from the direction of his old Chevy, reading the tension like weather signs. At 68, Obi was still built like the farmer he'd been, with hands that could gentle a frightened horse or stop a charging bull. 30 years of friendship had taught him to recognize trouble, and Zella was trouble in a designer dress. Just discussing practical matters, Zella said, her irritation at the interruption flickering across her face before the mask slipped back into place. Practical matters can wait, Obi said quietly, positioning himself slightly between us. Man deserves time to grieve his son. Of course he does. Zella's smile was razor thin. That's exactly why I'm inviting everyone to the house for refreshments. A proper memorial gathering. This was news to me. Jeffrey would have wanted something simple, quiet, but Zella was rewriting his story in real time, making herself the generous hostess instead of the vulture picking over his bones. That sounds lovely, Mrs. Henderson said, clearly relieved to have something normal to focus on. Jeffrey would have appreciated that. The others murmured agreement, accepting the invitation without question. Zella's smile widened as she watched them fall into line, establishing herself as the proper host of Jeffrey's memory. You'll come too, won't you, Clyde? Her tone was silk over steel. It's important that family be there. Family, the word was an insult wrapped in courtesy, delivered in front of people who'd known me since before Jeffrey was born. She was daring me to refuse to look petty and difficult in front of the community. Something's not right about this, Obi murmured, stepping closer so only I could hear. His farmer's instincts were sharper than most folks realized, but the others were already heading toward their cars, talking about what dishes they'd bring, and how Jeffrey would have loved seeing everyone together. Zella had successfully hijacked my son's memory, turning his funeral into her coronation. I'll see you at the house, she said, triumph glittering in those blue eyes. After all, it's still your son's house for now. The emphasis on for now was deliberate. Another small cruelty, delivered with surgical precision. She climbed into Jeffrey's Mercedes, her Mercedes now, and pulled away, leading the caravan of mourners to what had been my home for the past 3 years. I stood in the cemetery parking lot, rain soaking through my jacket, watching taillights disappear down the main road. The funeral was over, but something else was beginning.